So this is a book of essays rather than poems, and so not designed for reading out loud, so I'll probably just read one of the essays. This is from the first section of the book, from spring 2020, during the first lockdown, and this is called "He Was Roaring Around Like a Bullet." The clocks change, the evening light extends, the lockdown continues. Notes accumulate in piled up notebooks, scrawled, scratchy and unreadable. Threads taken up and dropped, the needle spooling uselessly away. But talking through things together is another way. For weeks now, F, L, T and I have been gathering through digital calls to talk about the new English translation of Volume 2 of Peter Weiss's The Aesthetics of Resistance. With each one of us in a different country, dispersed, it's the lockdown that brings us back together through the screen, as we turn to Weiss's enormous record of accumulated and unassimilable detail, his attempt to provide a way through, in which his aesthetics provides what history doesn't, history from below, or history from somewhere else entirely, a collapse of time into condensation, constellation, concatenation of voices heard and overheard, threads picked up and dropped, the grave solidity of marble and, like a sponge, absorbing, full of gaps and holes, porous and open to the air. Of all literary forms, the novel is the one into which, most often, it seems everything can go, the form for chronicling all the minute vicissitudes of emotional life and the society that produced them, for capturing everything from the textures of a single moment to those of an entire epoch. But this particular novel soon exceeds even this excessive framework. It took Weiss decades to write this 3-volume version of the wars and displacements he'd lived through, rendered in his account as a series of sedimented or palimpsestic layers of compressed historical time. Years compressed into an expanded sentence, time squeezed through the needle's eye. Reading Weiss, together or alone, particular details emerge and recede, the insignificant give an undue significance as we pore over a single word, telling historical detail passing us by. This week, one sentence in particular stands out. The saint wasn't floating, he was roaring around like a bullet, his legs disappearing in a flaming crowd. For dozens of pages, the book's narrator has exhaustively reflected on how Géricault's Raft of the Medusa addresses its world historical epoch, trying to imaginatively reconstruct Géricault's imaginative reconstruction of the situation of abjection, shipwreck, of those caught in the interstices of the violence of colonialism, the tendrils it winds around everything. Doing so involves a careful, patient, and painful excavation of every trace on the canvas and every trace that led up to it. Géricault's own attempts at recreation, reading first-hand reports of the incident, recreating the raft in the studio, tossing and turning in feverish identification, historical accuracy as psychic projection, over-identification, a mania for detail that cannot help but blur its own edges in a diminishing grip on its own subject. Suddenly, Weiss's narrator realizes the quality of futility of his own project to solve every enigma in the painting. Instead, in Paris, on the eve of the occupation, as he wanders through the gallery before it's closed down in order to store the paintings away from imminent invasion, he settles on the smallness of a few obscure paintings, their artists anonymous or otherwise unknown, corpses piled on the barricades after the Commune, a martyrdom of St. George, a saint flying through a prison wall to free the poor from jail. And that is the saint, tiny saint. It's a small painting, that's kind of the point. The saint wasn't floating, he was roaring around like a bullet, his legs disappearing in a flaming cloud. The narrator sees a fullness and a virtue in these paintings' almost comically expansive smallness that suddenly means more to him than the world historical scale of the Géricault. That which is to the side of the grandiose, the grandiloquent, the summative, acts as history's barometer too, and perhaps a more accurate one. How these moments of condensation can be valuable to us in crisis, as ever things are in crisis. How a painting acts as container for the space and scale of history. How it layers up time in the miniature as much as the gigantic canvas. And how the narrator walks through Paris into Montmartre and charts the accreted traces of resistance piled up around, in the face of, in the previous occupation of monuments temporarily seized by the bourgeoisie. The churches, the tombs, the streets. How here, time and space layer jagged, not fitting, escaping the edges of their frame. The saint wasn't floating, he was roaring around like a bullet, his legs disappearing in a flaming cloud. On common land now taken by the crown, I walked past a mound where John Bull preached, somewhere near what were then the gates to the city, when Adam delved and Eve span. He returned there as part of the massed forces of the peasants' revolt. Refusing the orders of the royal forces to turn back, they entered London, attacked the jails, destroyed the Savoy Palace, burned law courts, killed anyone associated with the government. The king agreed to abolish serfdom. The next day, the mayor of London murdered leader Wat Tyler at Smithfield. The king went back on his word, the usual story. Back to earth, disappearance of the flaming cloud. The gates to the city have long since expanded miles beyond, and the mound where John Bull preached is so flattened, it's almost unnoticeable as a mound, just some scraggly gorse bushes and a bench, next to a pond which is perennially half-drained, not even fully filling up where there's rain. Bounded by roads, by the houses of the rich, nearby to an army cadets training base which seems eerily, permanently empty, this green common, in name only, is what today passes for peace or refuge, the common space that seems safer when it's empty, when it's not crowded, not seething and teeming up with the masses of named and nameless and numberless gathered to storm the city, tearing down its courts where our comrades keep watch. Police report, arrestee support, cop vans, sirens, city symphony, the chokehold grip, the stifled yell, the pollution that chokes the breath, this new virus spread on the air itself. Today what surrounds is the steady and sustained stifling and choking and suffocating and drowning out of the voices that protest in the present and the accumulated chorus of historical memory, so that it resembles little more than a faint static, a hissing smoke, an escape of steam, water on the fire, the faint brightness of the burning cloud a long way off. Today we have to stay inside, to keep apart, a wager of safety against the ground we cede to an authoritarian state. Yet the common, the mound, the image or idea of the flaming cloud exists as a moment of possibility before defeat, place of insurgency, prophecy, vision. When Adam delved and Eve span, what we share in common, the air we breathe, itself peoples with danger, unwitting destruction, and commonness briefly gets found in absence, distance, emptiness. But perhaps that emptiness, as Vice has it, is all the more peopled with ghosts, the voices and presences that together form a chorus from out of static and into full-throated riposte. The saint wasn't floating, he was roaring around like a bullet. For things have only temporarily been seized by the bourgeoisie, and what opens up instead expands out from this moment of crisis, ripping apart that grip, abolition's approach, legs disappearing in a flaming cloud. The corpses revenant on the barricades, the empty pond promising fullness, the private ownership that one day will be dissolved for the space of the common, those who fly through the prison walls and through time, ensconced in flaming clouds, not floating but roaring around, all within us that remains unquenched. For the past doesn't perpetually enclose us in a hellish present of eternal return, but opens a path to what as yet we cannot see. Thanks.